Hi artists! I'm going to show you some basic watercolor skills, and first you will need a piece of watercolor paper and you'll need your watercolor palette, and you need a pencil and your water brush with water in it. You also need to get a cup of water. I have a glass of water here, and some paper towels or tissues or toilet paper works as well. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is label our artwork. So this is going to be Watercolor Basics. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is a value scale, just like we've done with pencil and colored pencil. So I'm going to draw a long rectangle here. And divide it into 5 or 6 squares or rectangles. The next thing I'm going to try is a few different techniques that you can use with watercolor. So the first one is called wet on wet, which means wet watercolor on wet paper. Next we're going to try wet on dry paper. So we'll make a couple boxes under those just as a guide of where to put the watercolor. And the next one, we're going to write tissue. And we're going to lift some of the color off using paper towel, or you can use, again, you can use tissues or toilet paper is fine. And the last technique we're going to try is called splatter. Okay, so let's start off with a value scale. I want you to put some water in each of the watercolor trays. All of you have a brush that's included in this palette, so put the brush keep on the back of the brush and get your brush wet, and I want you to put a little drop of water into each tray. So just enough to coat all the color. That's in the palette, in the tray. Okay, now you can choose your favorite color. So I'm going to use purple today. And I'm going to start as light as I can. So I'm going to take the purple and put a lot of water in it and use the palette here to mix the purple with water. So on the left, I'm going to make it very, very, very light color, light value. And then in each step, I'm going to get a little darker. So I'm going to grab a little pigment from the tray, mix it with my water, and the next rectangle is a little darker, and then get a little more purple. So each step gets a little darker. It's pretty dark. I'm going to add a little water. I feel like that's a little too dark. There we go. So you can see it's getting darker and darker value as I get down to the right. Okay, and then the last step, just use the pure watercolor from the tray. Okay, you can just take it directly from your tray of colors. Okay, so you can see the range that you can get with the purple. You can get very, very light and very, very dark. It's important to use different values when you're using watercolor. Okay, now I'm going to rinse my brush so there's just water in it. And we're going to try the wet on wet. So I'm going to add some water onto the paper, the square that says wet on wet. Just water, no color. And then I'm going to take, I'm going to use some red. You can use any color you'd like. And you can see what happens when you add wet watercolor to wet paper. It bleeds a lot. So you see I just put one drop of red and it already bled all the way across the paper. So the water kind of helps it spread out. I'm going to take some purple and use the opposite side to let it bleed across the paper. And then I'm just going to blend it a little. So I'm going to use my paper towel to blot some of the pigment out and then blend it in with the red. So purple and red are nice colors together because they're similar colors. They're close together on the color wheel. Okay, I'm going to use a little more red. So kind of just play around with it. Let them blend together. So I like creating a contrast so that I have some light and some dark. Okay, next we're going to try wet on dry, which is the same thing we did with the value scale. So see what difference that you can get when you just put wet watercolor on dry paper. It's a little more easy to control, but it's kind of less exciting because it doesn't give you these surprises that the wet paper can give you when it bleeds. So I'm going to use my purple and then add a little water to my brush. You can add water to the brush, but the paper itself is dry when you start. Okay, so I have a little more control, but it's not as surprising. Okay, now we're going to try using, I'm going to put my palette up here. We're going to try using tissue and a method called Splatter. So I'm going to do the same colors. I'm going to put a little bit of water first. So this is wet on wet with the tissue. I'm going to take some red, let it bleed, rinse my brush, take some purple, let it bleed, and then I'm going to take my paper towel and try to lift some of the pigment out. So this is a method, if you make a mistake, you can quickly erase somewhat the watercolor, but you have to work quickly because it dries very fast. Or if you're trying to blend, you can use tissue to lift it. I'm going to add a little more pigment here. So you see I use a lot of water with watercolor, which is probably why it's called watercolor. Okay, and then I feel like I have too much water on my paper, so I'm going to use the tissue to blot it up. Okay, the last technique that we're going to try is splatter, which a lot of students like to do because it's a quick and fun trick. So you're going to take your brush with a little pigment in it, and you're going to use your finger to flick it across the page. I'm going to take some purple. So this is like a technique that you can use at the end of a painting just to add a little bit of flair and excitement to your artwork. This is hard to control, so one thing you can do is put some paper around it to keep it from getting on the other parts of your work. Take a little more red. Okay, and these are 5 basic watercolor techniques that you can use on any watercolor artwork.